Hi, everyone, and welcome to Access to Employment, a dialogue on inclusive workplaces. This is the second Access to Employment webinar we're hosting, and we will be focusing on neurodiversity, specifically autism and dyslexia. My name is Robbie Anderson, and I'm Associate Director of the Charity Recruitment Team at Alton Consulting. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by our two expert speakers, Danae Leaman-Hill, Director of External Affairs and Development from Ambitious About Autism, and Helen Goodsall, Knowledge and Information Manager from British Dyslexia Association. Research estimates that more than 15% of the population are neurodivergent. This umbrella term includes conditions including autism, dyspraxia, ADHD, and dyslexia, and many live with more than one neurodivergent condition. Yet the conditions of the world of work, recruitment processes, office environments, face-to-face meetings, management techniques, pardon me, are geared towards neurotypical brains. The object of today's session is to discuss the role that internal recruitment, human resources, senior leadership, and line managers play in creating an inclusive workplace, specifically focusing on making recruitment processes and approaches to retention inclusive and removing barriers wherever possible so people with autism and/or dyslexia can thrive within their careers. Many of you have already submitted questions when registering for the event, and if any of you have any questions that come up throughout the discussion, please feel free to ask them using the chat function. After Danae and Helen have spoken, there will be a Q&A, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can. Without further ado, over to you, Danae.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much, Robbie, for having me today. You're going to pop some slides up for me.
We're just having a slight technical issue here, so sorry, Danae, one moment. I think
That's absolutely fine. I'm happy to start talking. Oh, there we are. No, I'll press ahead anyway. So really nice to be here every day and have the opportunity to talk about Ambitious About Autism, about autistic young people, and about how to create autism-confident workplaces. So I wanted to start by just explaining a little bit about Ambitious About Autism. So we were founded about 28 years ago, initially as one school, and we were founded by parents who were despairing at the lack of suitable education provision for their young people. And in fact, as our young people have grown, the diversification and scale of our services has grown too. So we now tackle all the areas that are significant in enabling a young person to progress successfully to adulthood, which includes education, of course, but it also includes employability, participation, health and well-being, family support, and more. And we deliver a wide range of direct services, but we also campaign and we influence for system change, because we recognise that to truly impact positively on the lives of all autistic young people, we can't do it alone, and we certainly can't do it through direct service delivery alone. This really needs a wholesale approach. So perhaps if we could move to another slide.
Our system allows us to. We will. Sorry, Danae.
No, it's fine. I'll carry on talking anyway.
Yeah, PowerPoint's not working for us today for some reason.
No worries at all.
Thank you.
The next thing I wanted to just explain briefly is, so if we could move to the next slide beyond that one. I just wanted to explain about autism, actually. So our definition of autism is are you able to move to the next slide, Robbie, where we bring that up?
Yeah, sorry,
that's fine. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects the way somebody communicates or experiences the world around them. And you'll often hear autism described as a spectrum condition, because while autistic people share certain characteristics, they are highly individual in their interests, needs, and preferences. So everybody is somewhere different on the spectrum. Some autistic people live independently, while others may need additional support. They may have a learning disability or other health needs, which might be mental health needs or epilepsy, for example. I think in short, every autistic person is different. And there's an overused phrase, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism, but it really holds true. And I think the thing I've learned in my time at Ambitious is autism really isn't well understood. And autistic people often face stigma and prejudice through lack of understanding. And in fact, and we've got the stat here, 70% of autistic young people fear discrimination if they disclose their autism to prospective employers, which is really sad. And also the prevalence of autism is higher than many people realise. So official data is quite out of date now, and we're pushing for this to be refreshed on the part of the government. So while we officially say that more than 1 in 100 is autistic, it's likely to be at least double that figure. So if we're able to move on to the next slide, I just wanted to say a little bit about the challenges that autistic people face. And I wanted to start by putting the view of autistic young people right at the heart of this. So we talk daily to autistic young people. We have an immense youth network, and we asked autistic young people, what's the thing they worried about most? And they said employment. And actually, they're right to worry, because employment is typically out of reach for most autistic people. In fact, only 29% of autistic adults are in any kind of work, that's full or part-time. And the reasons for this have nothing at all to do with an autistic person's ability or willingness to work. In fact, most autistic people want to work. And there are literally thousands who have degrees, master's degrees, PhDs. They have so much to offer to the world of work, and they'd love that opportunity, but the system is just stacked against them. So they typically don't receive good career support while they're in school or college that might address their specific needs. They also don't typically have access to work experience or internships, and they face what we would describe as a neurotypical bias within employer recruitment systems that can be just impossible to navigate. For autistic people who do find work, so the lucky ones, they're typically underemployed, which means that the job they're doing is below their skill set. So it's hardly surprising that autistic employees experience less job satisfaction than non-autistic people. And of course, there's that general lack of understanding and acceptance that I mentioned earlier, coupled with stigma and unfortunately bullying, which means that 80% of autistic people have a mental health condition. So when you take all of this into account, of course, the economic cost of this lost employment is immense. The official stats for this are reasonably out of date, and we're working with LSE at the moment to update these, but we know from some years ago that a staggering £9 billion a year in this country alone is lost in lost employment opportunities. But we're getting some updated statistics on that from LSE in the next few months, and we suspect that that figure will have gone up. If we could move to the next slide. I just wanted to say something about talents and skill sets. We want employers to address the autism employment gap and give autistic young people a chance. But the point I want to make is this isn't because we want to position autistic employees as bringing business benefits. Autistic people are typically of average intelligence and skills, just like you and me. There are actually very few savants or geniuses. But I do also want to share this slide and it's taken from Anna Remington, who is a researcher we work very closely with at UCL, who highlights some of the strengths and abilities an autistic person can bring to the workplace. Because, you know, I do want to highlight the power of people who do think differently. So, for example, regarding mental abilities, an autistic employee can bring strengths in things like pattern recognition, attention to detail, often incredible creativity. When it comes to productivity, autistic employers can be efficient problem solvers and highly productive. One of our employer partners came to me to discuss an intern, a young intern that we placed with him. And he said, Danae, I've got a problem here. And I was really worried. But actually his issue was that his autistic intern was completing tasks so quickly and far more quickly than other interns they'd had in the organization. He just couldn't generate tasks quickly enough for him. I think it's fair to say that autistic employees can often display a real drive for fairness and honesty. And, you know, sometimes this might be aligned with the fact that they feel less pressure to comply with social norms. And of course, as I said at the beginning, autistic employees can think differently, bring unique perspectives. You know, they may also enjoy activities that some other people may find difficult. They may also see or say things that no one else does. You know, I always turn to the autistic team members in my own team and say, tell me the things that you're seeing that none of us are seeing and no one else dares say. And, you know, their input is golden. But I also want to just reiterate that I'm not here to commodify autistic people. This is about equity and fairness and the benefits of a diverse workforce in general. So hopefully that leads neatly on to my next slide, which is just about, you know, what you can achieve by opening your doors to autistic talent in terms of being a more diverse workforce. So, you know, access to an untapped talent pool. You might be making it feel more psychologically safe for other autistic or neurodiverse colleagues to be themselves and be more open about their needs. And of course, once they're open about their needs, their line manager can put the right adjustments in place to help them really thrive. You may also find yourself increasing productivity and diversity of thought, you know, and you're modeling the diversity within your client and customer communities. And that diversity is bound to be there, whether you have the data to see that yet or not. And then I just wanted to move on to talking about some more practical tips for recruitment. So when we train employers on adjusting their practice, they often report back that this was actually simpler than they thought it would be. And they also recognise that these adjustments work for autistic people, neurodivergent people in general, and indeed non-autistic people. So here are a few suggestions that I just wanted to run through, starting with using clear and jargon-free language in job descriptions and adverts. Autistic candidates often deselect themselves from a job application process because they don't meet a requirement in the job spec. And that's really worth thinking about, because often we see job specs and often we write job specs that include requirements that, if we're honest, really aren't relevant to a role. You know, a neurotypical person may recognise that you don't actually need to be a team player for a data entry role, but an autistic person may take a more literal approach and may assume it isn't for them and deselect themselves from that process before the employer has even had a chance to see what they might bring to the role. Another practical tip is to consider whether an interview is always necessary in enabling a candidate to show their suitability. So, for example, if the role doesn't require communication skills in answering questions, could the candidate be tested on their skills through delivery of a task or through a job trial? you know, it's an interview setting is an unnatural setting for anyone, but for an autistic person that could be particularly challenging, and again may deselect them from the process for recruiting to a job that they might otherwise be really well suited to. The next point I wanted to make was to be open from the outset, invite conversations about adjustments. So this is really about recognizing that everyone has different needs. So don't make judgments or assumptions. Ask each candidate what adjustments may make the whole process and experience more comfortable for them. So this might be things like sharing questions in advance, providing pictures of panel members, providing a picture of the room the interview will take place in, maybe providing access to stimming materials, so fidget toys, that sort of thing, and, you know, not making a big deal out of that, but just really normalizing that for everyone. At Ambitious About Autism, we now offer adjustments to all candidates who apply to us for jobs, irrespective of whether they have a diagnosis of anything or not. And actually, our recruitment outcomes are better as a result. I then wanted to talk about just a few practical tips for supporting new or autistic employees. And some of the same rules apply in terms of what I've just described, in terms of supporting those who are in your business already or in the process of joining your business. So the first one was around getting to know the individual. So again, this is about recognizing that everyone is different and has different needs. So as a line manager, really take the trouble to get to know the individual and find out from them what will help them thrive. And this leads neatly on to the next point, which is that some people don't know what adjustments they need, particularly if they are new to the working environment. So recognize this, give your autistic employees the opportunity to trial different adjustments and different approaches, and also expect their needs to change in time. You know, moving to the next point I wanted to make sure you check in regularly. And also, if you make an arrangement, stick to it, provide really clear and direct feedback in a format that you know is effective and accessible for the people you're supporting. What we've learned is that most line managers who've been through our programme and been trained by us report back that their line management and communication skills have improved through supporting autistic team members, which actually benefits everyone in the organisation. I just wanted to move on to explaining a bit about our Employee Autism programme. We've been running some sort of employability support for about 8 to 10 years now, but over the last 4 years, we've trialled a much broader programme. It's been independently evaluated, and we now know that our programme is making a statistically significant difference to employers' efficacy in supporting autistic people. So we're really pleased about that. And I just wanted to explain what we do. So we provide training and resources to employers, and we support them in providing internships to autistic young people. It's been hugely successful. 83% of all the interns who've been through our programme have been offered a contract extension or permanent job at the end of that internship. And when you contrast that with what I said at the beginning about the fact that only 29% of autistic adults are in work, we know that this is a model that's effective. And if we could just move to the next slide, I just wanted to say a little bit about how we're trying to change the system, because it's not autistic people who need to change, it's the system and the environment around them that needs to change. So our programme helps employers to become autism confident in their policies and practice. We help them to revise their policies, create inclusive workplaces, which might be through environment assessments and things like that. We provide support for their existing colleagues who might be autistic or neurodivergent, and we help employers to adjust their systems so that they can both recruit and retain autistic talent. And finally, we increase understanding and awareness. And actually what happens with that is that parents and carers within the workforce feel like, yes, the thing I grapple with when I go home every night and is lived experience within my family is now understood by my employers, my colleagues. So it is all round an enriching process for everyone. And then if we move to my final slide, this is just a snapshot of some of the employer partners we're working with, you know, who are all on that journey to becoming autism confident, or indeed are there already. And I know that we've got lots of charities represented within this webinar, and we've worked really proudly with lots of charity partners as well. So I'm not trying to plug my services, but I'm just trying to say we can all do this. Ambitious About Autism is on that journey to being an autism confident employer too, and it has been the most immensely rewarding experience for all of us. So that's it from me.
Thanks very much, Danae, and particularly given the technical difficulties we had at the beginning, that was a very good talk. On to you, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Helen Goodsall. I'm Knowledge and Information Manager at the British Dyslexia Association. Can I have the next slide, please?
And if,
we got the same, the gremlins are back, are they?
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and yes, you move straight from that one into the next one. Thank you. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the BDA for people who may not know us and what we do, and then about dyslexia, particularly dyslexia in the workplace, how dyslexia fits as a disability within the Equality Act and making reasonable adjustments, and then looking specifically at the life cycle of, you know, employing people, having an inclusive workplace, and assistive technology, which is becoming increasingly important. Can I have the next slide, please? So the BDA was founded in 1972, so we've been going over 50 years. We are the leading national dyslexia charity. There are many local dyslexia charities who kind of pick up with individuals. Ours is much more of a kind of an umbrella organisation. We have three main areas. Our intention is to raise awareness of dyslexia. So we run sessions like this so that we can inform and educate people to encourage inclusion within schools and workplaces. We also promote understanding of dyslexia. It's fair to say that over the last 50 years, the understanding and the awareness of dyslexia has increased. There's research ongoing, and you know, we will always be looking to promote the latest evidence and research that's there. We set professional standards for teacher training. That's the specialist teachers who are there to support dyslexic children at school. And we also empower people by speaking out on behalf of the dyslexic community to try and champion a dyslexia-friendly society with a vision of a world where people with dyslexia can flourish. Have the next slide, please. So what is dyslexia? Well, you might be interested to know that there is no one definition of dyslexia, but it's a neurological condition that really affects information processing. Research shows us it affects about 10% of the population, so that's over 3 million adults in the workplace. Chances are most workplaces have at least one dyslexic employee, but they may not know that they are dyslexic. It affects all genders, ages, abilities and ethnicities, and it's not due to poor education, although obviously that can impact and make it more difficult for people. It primarily impacts accurate word reading and spelling, but it can also impact upon people's ability to organise themselves, to manage their time. And people with dyslexia often have difficulties with working memory. So that's that holding that information in their memory while they're able to actually process it and manipulate it. It's common to find that dyslexic people have a slower speed of processing information. Sometimes that's because they're kind of trying to decode what's actually said, particularly if that's written information. But dyslexia is very hidden. In some people, you probably wouldn't know at all that they're dyslexic. And as a result of that, many people go undiagnosed. It's harder for them to work and to just carry out a lot of activities at work. So they have to work harder to compensate, to keep up with their colleagues. And so, they're people that typically might experience stress in the workplace. It can also impact upon their confidence, their self-esteem, and obviously lead to more mental health challenges. Everybody with dyslexia is different. I think that's something that we heard earlier about autism. And everybody will have their own unique strengths and challenges. So it's also true that just because you've met one dyslexic person and you know how they are, doesn't mean that everybody with dyslexia will be the same or that they'll have the same challenges. So the impact in the workplace can vary very much depending on the type of role somebody's doing. Have the next slide, please. So what are some of the common signs of dyslexia in the workplace? Well, as I said earlier, it's largely hidden. Sometimes the sort of first signs are that there seems to be a mismatch between the person in terms of how they present verbally, that just doesn't come across so well in their written work. But they also may be somebody who lacks confidence in their own ability. They may be very able to do the job, but they feel that they can't because they have concerns from lack of support or feeling stupid or struggling at school, and that can carry on through life and affect their confidence. They also may be trying to avoid certain tasks that they know they find difficult. And so sometimes they can appear resistant to change. And that's more because they often have their own coping strategies that work for them in a situation, and change can obviously mean that they need new coping strategies. As I said before, they can have challenges with organisational ability, and often because of processing difficulties, their work takes longer than they might expect it to, or they underestimate how long a task might take them to do. So there can be challenges, and people may miss deadlines. They can also have difficulties with tasks that require them to multitask. So one of the ones that's probably most commonly noticed is people struggling to take notes in a meeting, as well as listen in and comment on the conversation that's going on. Sometimes they can come across as being forgetful, and that's more a case of them not necessarily getting the information in and getting it into a long-term memory, or struggling to recall something that they've been told. But on the flip side, they bring a very different way of thinking. They can be very innovative in the way that they solve problems, very creative, often with an ability to visualize and quickly see the big picture. And so, these are the type of people that we need in our workplaces, because we need innovation to actually move forward. If we all think the same, then, we carry on with the same old, same old. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So one of the things that we often get asked is dyslexia a disability? And one of the difficulties can be that so many dyslexic people don't have a formal diagnosis, and historically employers have been only supporting people who are able to produce a diagnostic assessment report showing that they are dyslexic. So I thought it'd be worth looking at the Equality Act to understand the definition of a disability, and then looking at how that applies to dyslexia. So the Equality Act says that a disability is a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. Can we have a look at the next slide, please? So how does that relate to dyslexia? Well, dyslexia is considered mental impairment. It meets the criteria to be considered mental impairment, although obviously that's not terminology that any dyslexic person would like to use to describe themselves. We also know that dyslexia is a lifelong condition, although it may be less evident as people get older in life and kind of can cope with things. It is there throughout life. So it also meets the criteria to be considered to be long-term. We know that it does have an adverse effect on day-to-day activities, particularly those that require processing or reading of information. So the question is really, is that impact substantial? And here's where there can be some difficulties, because dyslexia occurs primarily, I suppose, on a spectrum, in that, you know, it can be mild, it can be moderate, or it can be severe. So whether they impact somebody substantially depends very much on the individual, and it also depends on the role that they're doing as to whether it's having an impact. Can I have the next slide, please? So should we make reasonable adjustments? Well, you know, as the Equality Act says, reasonable adjustments are there to ensure that everybody can actually do their job and they're not substantially disadvantaged. And that can be the difficulty if you've got a dyslexic individual who doesn't have proof that they're dyslexic, and you have an employer who's saying, well, no, you know, I can't see a substantial disadvantage. But as we talked about, we heard earlier about autism, an inclusive workplace is good for everybody. It's good for business. And trying to incorporate accessibility as standard will benefit everybody. And for a lot of dyslexic employees will be all that's needed to enable them to do their job. For the next slide, please. So how do we put that into practice then? Well, we start with looking at inclusive recruitment. As we heard from Danae earlier, lots of people will deselect themselves because they don't believe that the role will meet their needs, or that they'll be able to meet the needs of the role. So it might seem a strange thing to say, but actually it's worth looking right from the start and considering the role that you're recruiting for, and looking at what are the specific skills and experience that's needed. It can be tempting in large organisations particularly to just go for standard role definitions, which often ask for a lot of experience or skills that are actually really not needed for a particular thing. So it's about defining what really is needed for that particular role. And interestingly, if you start looking at those skills and then think, well, what reasonable adjustments can work, and you build that in at the beginning, then you're much better prepared to know that that support can be put in place, and to write the role according to that. Accessible adverts are obviously the next stage, and as well as ensuring that the language used is accessible, it's about thinking about the application process and whether the format of that application process is accessible. So online application forms can be very difficult to complete, particularly for somebody who might be using screen reading technology, or for somebody who might want to dictate their answers. So could you use alternative formats? Could you use give somebody the option to upload a short video talking about themselves? Could you offer a phone-based service where you take basic information from somebody? It's looking at different ways of doing things, which, you know, we're starting to see come in, particularly in more creative roles. But it's looking at what could happen as standard. And when you come on to shortlisting candidates, it's looking at how people meet the criteria for the key skills that are needed. Dyslexic individuals quite often have not come through a standard route in education, particularly if they haven't been diagnosed at school. You know, they may not have got the qualifications, they may not have gone on the normal routes, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to do the job. And one of the other points that I wanted to make is that increasingly in selection, people are using AI generated tools to kind of screen CVs and things. And there is growing body of evidence that this suggesting that these somehow are discriminating against dyslexic and other neurodivergent individuals, so they're being deselected from interview. Have the next slide, please. So when we come on to interview, I was interested to hear the comment earlier about whether an interview is the best process, best way of recruiting somebody. And I would also say that in a lot of cases, dyslexic individuals will not show their best ability in an interview. Trying to do something under time pressure, having to respond quickly to questions, all of those things can be really difficult for somebody to do. And they can come across as hesitant or not knowing what they're talking about, which may not be the case at all. It might just be that they can't recall that information quickly, or they've forgotten what the question was. So I would say it's really important that interviewers understand dyslexia and neurodiversity. So when they see those sort of things in an interview, they realise actually it's just dyslexia. And maybe if I ask that question again, or I rephrase that question, they may be able to then come back with a better response. We would always say to offer reasonable adjustments for people. And we talked earlier about having questions in advance, for example. And I've met a lot of resistance from employers who are saying, oh, that gives them an unfair disadvantage. I guess it comes back to understanding what it is that you're trying to see they can do in that interview. And obviously in some roles, if you are recruiting for somebody who needs to be able to think on their feet and respond quickly, perhaps you need to be able to test they can do that. So you will be exploring topics that they've not seen before. But for the majority of people, you're asking them to demonstrate their ability to do a particular role. And there's no reason why questions shouldn't be given in advance. And if you feel that maybe that's an advantage for dyslexic candidates, why not give it to everybody that you're interviewing? It just makes for a different type of interviews. But if you're looking to offer reasonable adjustments, I would say that people coming to interview need to understand what to expect from that day. It can be quite difficult to say, oh yes, I need reasonable adjustment, and to tell you what that should be if you don't know what to expect. So somebody who's coming to a big panel interview will find that a very different experience from perhaps just a one-on-one one. And if your day is including kind of assessments and things, and people might have to do testing and things on screen, then the set of reasonable adjustments, such as sort of extra time or different formats, etc., will be very different from if it's just an interview. And moving on then, if we're looking at assessment and selection, we would say that, you know, look at the accessibility of any testing that you're doing. Make sure that you are not disadvantaging people from demonstrating their knowledge or their skills simply because of the way that something is being tested. Very much take a skills-based approach. So, for example, you know, rather than setting everybody a standard test to write something and demonstrate that, you know, they can show spelling, punctuation and grammar, look at how they might do that in the workplace. You know, if they are able to dictate an answer, then allow that as part of the assessment. If you're doing a test to look at people's numeracy, don't set a standard maths test. Set one that's actually looking at the skills they need. Can they, for example, take down a telephone number correctly? Or can they put digits into a spreadsheet? It's looking at what that person will need to do in their job and looking for ways to test that that's what they can do, rather than just putting in general things which might present obstacles for a lot of people. And of course, offering reasonable adjustments that would be there in the workplace if they were carrying out those tasks is an essential part of the assessment and selection. Can I have the next slide, please? So when you have people in the workplace, I think having an environment that offers reasonable adjustments for everybody, or has that conversation with everybody, makes it far easier for staff to broach it. I've spoken to people who sort of say, you know, as line managers, I didn't feel comfortable having that conversation with somebody. I suspected that they needed some support, but having that conversation was difficult. If, as part of the onboarding process, you have that as a conversation, then it sets the awareness for people that actually you are open to having that, but it also is not such a difficult conversation to have. And ensuring that everybody in the workplace understands dyslexia through dyslexia awareness training is also important, because that shows people the simple adjustments that can be made to support things in terms of how they might approach people. Different people need information in different formats, so it's kind of understanding about those things. But overall, it's about having an accessible and an inclusive culture. And that's not just for dyslexic individuals, but that's so that everybody feels included in that. It's looking at things like your policies and seeing whether either they need to be rewritten or whether there's some flexibility. You know, for example, things like hot desking can be really difficult for a dyslexic person who perhaps needs to work in a quiet area of the office, or needs to leave a screen and a workstation set up. You know, they are then dependent on being the first one in the office so they can get that area they need. So having the ability to opt out of a hot desking policy, you know, that can be really useful for people. Other things, policies on using mobile phones. A lot of dyslexic individuals will use things on their mobile phones to check spelling, or they'll use apps that give them alarms and reminders and things. So, you know, ensuring that people still have those things that are part of their coping strategies, it's really important. In terms of supporting people, you know, giving them peer support is great. Maybe hosting a dyslexia support network so that you have a number of dyslexic employees together, you know, so they can air their views, they can work collectively on things that they think need improving in a workplace. But also buddy schemes, particularly with senior people within an organisation who are dyslexic, or if you don't happen to know that they're dyslexic, it's people who understand about dyslexia and can support people either as a buddy or as a mentor. And reasonable adjustments passports. Danae mentioned that people often don't know what reasonable adjustments they need, and that as time goes on, often those things change. Having a reasonable adjustment passport that kind of sets out what people believe they need, and revisiting that and having it as something that's portable to take with them as they move on through the organisation can just make the process so much smoother for everybody. Have the next slide, please. So one thing that's become really, really important for dyslexic people, and it's changing so fast, is assistive technology. And it really can be game-changing, not just screen reading technology that helps people because it provides a multi-sensory approach of seeing and hearing words on screen as they're going through, which can really help. And dictation for people who actually prefer to put their information down like that as opposed to write it. But things such as AI, you know, ChatGPT is really being useful for people who can't get their words down in a format that perhaps meets the criteria for a business. So ChatGPT is really good at rephrasing things for people, and so that it meets kind of business standards on things. Increasingly, technology is built in. You know, things like Office 365 have immersive reader and dictation as standard. Making people aware of those things in an organisation means that a huge amount of employees will find those things are sufficient without the need to actually go further and buy specialist software. Chrome also has a number of extensions that provide the same facilities. I touched on slightly before mobile phone accessibility features. You know, things like alarms and reminders for people who might struggle with timekeeping, and voice commands, and the ability to check words that you're not sure of the meaning of or can't spell correctly, all things that are great on mobile phones. And increasingly, the number of mobile phone apps that are being developed to help people with organisation, particularly planning and things on the go, so that rather than having to remember that your next meeting is going to be in 3 weeks' time at 4 o'clock, you can put it straight into a diary there and then. electronic calendars and reminders that enable you to work, sorry, that's fine, that enable you to work across teams and things, you know, all of these things really, really do help people. Having the next slide, please. So finally, I'm just going to say everything that I've talked about today. We have a free guide that's available on our website, and if you're quick and you have a phone, you may be able to take the QR code there, but I'm sure it will be available for you afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. That was brilliant and very insightful. And just to say, we will be sharing these slides and a recording of today's session with everyone that registered for the webinar later today or tomorrow. Thank you. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. We've had quite a few questions around kind of the way that you position to candidates in a recruitment process, the questions on any reasonable adjustments that are needed. Obviously, there are sometimes issues with people not wanting to share that they may be neurodivergent. So how do you sort of sensitively approach them? And Helen, maybe if we can start with you.
Yeah, I think that can be a difficult one. I would say if you are quite obvious and open in all your advertising and in your websites, and people can see that you are an inclusive organisation, then people will feel much more able to disclose that. I mean, we would always advise somebody who's looking for a job is, you know, look at the organisation first and see whether you think they are dyslexia friendly, are they open to it? So I think it's being quite open and people being able to see that, which makes it easier then, because it's easy to ask on a letter inviting someone for interview. It's easy to ask if anyone has reasonable adjustments, and for someone to say no because they don't feel comfortable. So it's knowing that that won't be met with a negative response.
Thank you, Helen. Danae, do you have anything to add?
I agree with everything Helen said. You know, really try to promote yourself as an inclusive employer, but recognize that some people simply won't disclose. You know, like I said at the beginning of my slides, 3/4 of autistic young people don't feel confident disclosing their autism. And actually, that's understandable. We've had accounts of one person submitting 50 job applications and disclosing she was autistic and not getting a single interview invitation. And then she submitted one where she didn't disclose her autism, and she did get invited to something. So, you know, whether that's accidental or not, it really feels like some discrimination exists. So make your adjustments available to anyone who'd like them. You know, normalize inclusive practice. For example, sharing questions in advance, you know, sharing explicit information about the process, reviewing how you communicate with candidates. Do that for everyone, because it doesn't give neurodivergent people an unfair advantage. It just gives everyone, you know, a good opportunity to genuinely show why they're right for that role. And if you're worried about that, trial it, you know, and see if that does sit comfortably with your recruitment practice as an organisation.
Thank you, Danae. I've got a question here on performance management. How do you approach understanding the difference between neurodiversity impacting performance and genuine areas for improvement where the neurodiversity isn't so obvious? Danae, can I aim that one at you first, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit outside of my area of expertise, because that's a real HR question. No, but it's a good question. I mean, I think it's about being really clear with your colleagues who might need, you know, have other needs and need adjustments, specifically what those needs are and what the adjustments are that would help them to manage those situations better. Write them down, make sure everyone signs up to them. And then if there are performance issues outside of that, then they're performance issues to be addressed differently. But I think it's about having absolute clarity at the outset of somebody's employment. What are their needs? What are the adjustments that you're putting in place that are indeed reasonable? And so, you know, distinctions between that and performance are clear.
Great, thank you. Helen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree. But I would also say, if they are down to neurodiversity, and I'm thinking specifically dyslexia here, so you know, it might be poor spelling, punctuation, and grammar and things. You know, those things will generally be improved with the right reasonable adjustments, such as software to help them. If you implement those reasonable adjustments and somebody still can't do it, then it's a performance issue, because you know, nobody is asking an employer to accept things that are not of the standard that you know, would meet their business. They're being asked to make reasonable adjustments. So the first thing is to look at does a reasonable adjustment work, and consider that, regardless of whether you know somebody's neurodivergent or not.
Thank you, Helen. So we've got a few questions on recruitment processes specifically now. One participant has said, I'm planning to do a project to review our very traditional recruitment processes and would welcome guidance / top tips on how to start transforming recruitment to be more inclusive. Now, obviously, both of you have already shared many top tips and guidance on this, but do you have anything to add at all? Helen, I'll start with you, sorry.
I think it's looking at if you look at your existing things, it's looking at where those specific barriers might be to people. So again, it is kind of looking at whether you're asking for specific experience or skills or qualifications, and whether those are relevant to the role. Rather than just looking at across your organisation and saying, well, we always put that information in, we always ask for 5 GCSEs, we always ask for maths and English, etc. standard. It's kind of, do we need those things? So it's kind of starting right from scratch and saying, why is this in our recruitment advert, or why is this recruitment process, and does it create any barriers for people?
Thank you. We did a webinar with the Charity Finance Group a couple of weeks ago, and it was about recruitment and retention of staff. And one of the things that came up was maybe putting yourself in the shoes of a job seeker and trying to apply for a role at your own organisation online. Sometimes there's quite clunky and cumbersome applicant tracking systems in place that put people off applying and things like that. So that might be a good place to start. Danae, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'd add that this isn't, you know, a problem for HR teams to fix in isolation. This is about a kind of whole organisation culture change. So your leadership team should recognise the value and importance of doing this and celebrate it and see the benefits and make sure that's communicated everywhere. Then all of your recruiting managers should likewise see this as a positive thing. You know, they may need a bit of training into, you know, understand neurodiversity and, you know, how that might present and how to communicate more effectively. But this is about getting the whole of the organisation behind this, rather than HR having to push process change that might feel challenging.
Thank you, Danae. And then the final question on that we have up front on recruitment processes is, what would you say are the key points of consideration for ensuring details and enclosures within recruitment packs are inclusive as possible? And specifically, what would you say are 3 of the most unhelpful things candidates, and from your perspective, Danae, with autism experience during the recruitment process?
I think what's challenging for candidates is when processes aren't followed correctly. Because if people, you know, if employers aren't following the timeline they set out, you know, you're not coming back to someone within the time frame you agreed, dates are shifting, that can be really unsettling for an autistic person. I think also being really clear and transparent about what the process looks like. So if you're asking somebody to come to an in-person interview, you know, are there things that, for example, our charity head office is on the same site as one of our schools. So we have young people roaming the grounds. And if you didn't know about that, that might be unsettling because you weren't expecting to interact with a a young person when you thought you were coming for a job interview for a finance job. So, you know, just being really clear and explicit about what the experience will entail so that there are no surprises. Was there 3?
You don't have to. You've given 2 very good ones. So
Okay, cool.
I can move on to Helen. Helen, what would you say are 3 of the most unhelpful things candidates with dyslexia can experience during a recruitment process?
So I think inaccessible application forms that say you have to fill in this online, you can't send in a CV, or there's no other way through it, because most online forms don't work well with either screen reading technology or, but in particular with dictation things. So often you're getting people deselect themselves at the start because it's just too difficult to fill in an application form, particularly the ones that time out as you're going along and you have to have completed the whole thing in one go. You can't kind of save it and come back to it. And what else? I think not feeling that they can ask for reasonable adjustments because it might be misinterpreted as not having the ability to actually to do it. So, you know, it's that kind of not feeling confident in disclosing right at the start that they're dyslexic on an application form and not asking for it for an interview, and unnecessary testing of things that really aren't needed because they're just put in as standard recruitment tests for anybody entering a particular organisation, but are not really key for the person coming into that specific role.
Agreed. And on the reasonable adjustments, Helen, when and how often do you ask if these are required through a recruitment process?
So I think a lot of people do ask for it as standard, and increasingly it's on a form for people to put in, to disclose the disability and reasonable adjustments. I think it's actually more about having the confidence to ask. So it's about the point we made earlier that actually you need to be seen as an organisation that is welcoming this conversation, as opposed to just sort of ticking the box to say, well, we know we're supposed to ask for this, so we will do, but we don't really want you to ask, and actually you may be marked down, so to speak, if you do.
Thank you. I've got another question for you here, Helen. So this is about diagnosis. I was recently diagnosed with dyslexia in my early 30s, which has been a massive weight off my shoulders. Do you think there's been a rise in diagnosis for learning difficulties in adulthood?
It's very difficult to say from statistics. Anecdotally, I would say yes, more people are being diagnosed later. It's strange because really there's more understood now in education, so the expectation would be that more people should be picked up in schools, yeah. But we know routinely that they are not, and a lot of that is due to lack of funding. Most schools no longer have access to right support services to be able to get educational psychologists in to actually do a diagnosis. And one point I should make that perhaps people might not be aware of is that you have to pay privately to be assessed for dyslexia. It's not considered to be a medical condition, it's seen as an educational one. Therefore, there is no access through NHS under any means. It's not just a question of having to wait a long time. There isn't a route via a GP for it. So you're looking at either funding it yourself, or your employer funding it, or your educational establishment funding it for you. So that can mean that lots of people are not picked up. And also people who do quite well at school probably get through, provided they go through and they get the grades and they're seen as within the norm of people. They're often not picked up as dyslexic until they get into further or higher education, or sometimes in the workplace. If you're doing a specific role, it might be that part of, or that role specifically impacts you and your dyslexia, and then it leads you to think, hold on a second, why is this so difficult? So yeah, and it is increasingly more common to see adults being diagnosed.
So presumably if you can only get private diagnoses of dyslexia that people from lower income families are going undiagnosed.
Yes, yes, and because schools have so many other concerns in terms of funding, you know, with increases in kind of cost of living and things, then often schools are not able to fund them in the way that they might have done historically. So I think we will see a growing number of children who leave school without a diagnosis, and perhaps don't get formally diagnosed until adulthood, or possibly never diagnosed.
Thank you, Helen. Danae, do you anecdotally feel there's been a rise in diagnosis for learning difficulties in adulthood?
Well, we know that there are 150,000 people in England on an assessment waiting list for autism at the moment. And, you know, not all of those assessments, when they happen, will result in an autism diagnosis. But, you know, clearly many will. So it is really tough for people in that situation. But it's got me thinking, another point I wanted to make is it's really tough for parents and carers of young people who are autistic, dyslexic, you know, or have another neurodivergent condition and aren't getting assessment and therefore the support they need in education. It's very possible that their young person is struggling with their mental health. We know that over a quarter of autistic pupils in school are persistently absent at the moment, meaning they're off school they're missing out on 10% or more of their school year. So if you have mums and dads in your workforce who have this lived experience, they're having a pretty tough time right now. So if you can demonstrate your commitment to neuro-inclusivity as an employer, that helps them too.
I completely agree with that. My brother's my younger brother is severely autistic and lives in a care home, and he got a diagnosis, I think, in the mid-90s. But at first, the assumption was that he'd go into mainstream schooling, and he's 31 now, and he's still non-verbal. So I'm amazed that was the plan back then. And things have obviously massively changed since, not least in part due to the work of your employer, Danae. So moving on to work environment, Helen, I'll go back to you with this one, if that's okay. How can you make the workplace neurodiverse friendly for those who do not always want to share that they are neurodiverse?
So if we look at technology helps a huge amount of people by just putting screen readers and dictation software and allowing people to have planners and alarms and all of that kind of thing just as standard. They will really, really help people. If you're doing meetings, sending agendas in advance, meeting notes or anything that you need people to read in advance, sending things in accessible format so people can screen read, but they don't have to have requested that it's come in as a Word document rather than, you know, as a PDF. Having all of those things just in as standard really to help people. And I touched on it earlier, but kind of looking at your policies and thinking, is there anything in our standard policies that we have which might discriminate against certain groups of people and make it harder for them in the workplace? And, you know, we touched on things like hot desking. It would also apply to things like working from home. You know, for some people, working from home is fantastic. And for other people, working from home might be really difficult, because if you rely on certain technology and that isn't available to you at home, then, you know, that's obviously going to be really difficult. On the other hand, some people find using things like dictation software is easy to use at home because there's nobody watching them and they don't feel self-conscious in doing it. So it's kind of looking at all of your things and being flexible so that you don't sort of say everybody has to work 3 days at home and 2 days in the office, because that might not work for some people. So.
Thank you, Helen. And Danae, do you have anything to add at all?
Just listening to Helen makes me think that just all sounds like really, really good best management practice. There is not a thing she said that feels like additionality, you know, extra adjustments. You know, this is about normalizing good inclusive practice because it's just best practice all round.
Thank you. And this next question actually leads on quite well from something you were speaking about, Helen, particularly hot desking, working from home. So how do we meet in the same physical space the needs of staff who want or need quiet and calm environments, as well as those who prefer the office buzz? Danae, I'll start with you with this one.
Please make a quiet space available. You know, you might have designated a room for prayer and things like that. Could that also be a quiet space for people who just need to have a bit of decompression time, you know, or whatever, processing time, that sort of thing. And make that a nice space. Don't make it a broom cupboard or something like that. But also think about how you configure your office layout. If it's a hot desking culture, is there a designated area that can be a bit quieter, that's away from smelly kitchens and noisy printers, things like that? Just be a bit sensitive to all of that and think about people's sensory experiences. Some autistic people are undersensitized, some are oversensitized. One person said, if he bites into an apple across the room, it's like a pneumatic drill going off behind me. So just be mindful of that, but also think about those team dynamics. If you're going out for a team lunch, that might socializing and chit-chatting might be quite torturous for an autistic person, or they might love it and welcome it. But just understand from those individuals, what are you comfortable with and what can I help you understand? And sometimes it's just about having somebody explain those unwritten rules, you know, what they're expected to wear for a leaving drink for a colleague, you know, what's expected of them in terms of, you know, the more social, softer aspects of a working environment.
Thank you. Helen, do you have anything to add to that?
I think there's only the only other things I would say is sometimes if it's not possible to have a quiet space, allowing people to have headphones on so that they can do it without sort of saying, well, you know, what are they listening to? Recognizing that some people might need to listen to music and that kind of can divert them from kind of the noise that's going on and enable them to focus. Allowing people to kind of get up and have a rest break when they need it. You know, it's kind of those things that are kind of not seen as a, where are they going? You know, they've already gone out once this morning, or why are they listening to music? They're obviously not doing their work. You know, there's lots of things that historically wouldn't have been permitted in the workplaces or would have been seen as a not working. But I think we need to understand that actually, at the end of the day, if somebody's doing their job, then let them do it the way that works for them. And let's all, as Danae said, be tolerant of other people in the workplace, because everybody has different needs and we all need to work together.
Thank you, Helen. One more question on work environment. Is there any aspect of remote working that can be specifically difficult for those with autism or dyslexia? And would you like to address that one first?
Is that me? Did you say? Yeah.
Helen, sorry.
Helen.
As you've started, Danae, continue, please.
I think in remote working environments, people need to be really careful about the invisibility of people who are being supported remotely, you know, and make, you know, I said it in my presentation, but the importance of very regular check-ins, because an autistic colleague may have been in meetings or given information that they're struggling to interpret or process, or, you know, so just make sure that plenty of opportunities are there to check they're okay, they understand the information they've received, do they need any help transposing that into more digestible information, and also recognize that, you know, sometimes people, you know, in these situations have grown up in a hostile world that doesn't understand them. So there may be other things they're contending with around their well-being. So, you know, again, it's really important not to let people become too remote and invisible and, you know, unconnected with the organisation, because you don't know what's going on for them.
Thank you, Danae. Helen, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's only a couple of things. One is that, there are people who will find it difficult to focus and structure their day if they're at home. But there'll also be people who routinely work extra hours because they need to catch up, or to stay up to date because it takes them longer to do something. And I think it's important to have some means of checking in on people to make sure that, they're not routinely working till 8 o'clock at night, because that can happen. And obviously that wouldn't happen in a workplace because it's far more visible in a workplace than it is at home.
Yes, agreed. And moving on to the questions in the chat function now. This has been so helpful. So thank you, whoever's said that. We're increasingly seeing employees self-identifying as being autistic. What advice could you give them about supporting them to pursue a diagnosis? Danae, obviously, we'll aim that one at you.
Yeah, so as I said, waiting times are ridiculously long at the moment. So, of course, be a supportive employer, but don't wait for a diagnosis in order to understand what sorts of adjustments might help them to do their job better and then put them in place. I mean, if any employee came to you and said, I'm struggling with the way this is done, I'd like this adjustment to be put in place, it feels reasonable to me, and I'll be able to do my job better. Wouldn't you do that for everyone? So I think, again, it's just taking that, normalizing inclusive behavior, but also recognizing that if they're on a assessment pathway, it's a long road for them. So they will need your understanding and support in that.
Thank you, Danae. Helen, we'll ask the same question, but in relation to dyslexia. What advice would you give someone in supporting them to pursue a diagnosis for dyslexia?
So I would say it's very much the same. I would hope that an employer would be able to support them with any difficulties that they have in the workplace without having a formal diagnosis. But for them as an individual, the cost can be a real barrier for people. I mean, you're looking at sort of upwards of £500. So employers who are able to help, even if it's a part funding of that cost, can make a real difference to people. And although getting a diagnosis probably doesn't change the support that should be available, for some people it can be a real eye-opener to understanding more about themselves. And sometimes it can really lift that sort of feeling that people have had throughout life that they were stupid. And that's kind of stigma goes because actually suddenly there's an explanation for why they found things difficult. So I think kind of appreciating that side of it as well and supporting people through that is also very important for employers.
Thank you, Helen. And another question for you here, Helen. Rachel's asked, Helen, are you able to share more on what you said about building reasonable adjustments into job roles and when writing job descriptions? So
I think it's just looking at the key skills. So, for example, if you had a role where somebody's required to write reports, does it mean that they have to be able to sit at a laptop and type it in without any help whatsoever? It's about understanding kind of what that output should be, which is obviously a report that meets certain business standards, but actually, does it matter the way that they produce that? So sort of saying, well, actually, we're very happy with the report. We don't mind that it was produced by somebody dictating something or somebody who's had to proofread something using screen readers. So it's kind of looking at what you're doing, because some things can't be reasonably adjusted. Now I'm thinking where there might be a health and safety concern. If you look outside of the kind of environment of an office and you look at things like nursing or paramedics, giving people extra time to do things sometimes just cannot happen. You cannot allow somebody extra time to respond to a medical emergency, for example. So it's looking at what the specific things of that role are and how else somebody could do it, also how somebody could be helped to do it, which actually doesn't change the kind of performance standard that you expect them to be able to meet.
Very good, thank you, Helen. Danae, Rachel's also asked the question of you. Mentioned that Ambitious About Autism offers reasonable adjustments to all. Do you still ask applicants if they need reasonable adjustments throughout the recruitment process?
Yeah, of course. So there are some things we do as standard for everyone, you know, like sharing questions in advance when they're online interviews, making sure we post questions in the chat function, that sort of thing. But of course, everyone's different and other people may need other adjustments. And some of the things people ask for, again, seem really reasonable and good practice, but please, can you make sure panel members don't speak over the top of each other so that I can understand? Please, can you make sure questions are delivered in one question at a time, so you're not asking a question that has multiple points within it? Always simple things, but you know, just trying to understand from the individual what's right for them.
Thank you. I think we're on to our final question now, which is from Sarita Fleming. Sarita's asked, our application process entails answering 2 to 3 scenario-based questions. We reframe key tasks into challenging problems. How would you approach this, I assume? Do you think this is a possible barrier? Danae, would you mind starting?
It's hard to say without seeing the question and how it's positioned, but I would always think about how easy what you're trying. I think it's quite reasonable in an interview situation to present a scenario and understand from a candidate how they might respond in such a scenario, but I would make sure that that information is available in advance in order that they can anticipate that, make sure every element of the question that you're putting to them is broken down into clear chunks so they know what point they're addressing at each stage. And if the panel want to ask follow-up information on that, again, think really carefully how they deliver those requests and make it clear and easy to understand for the person to really show why they're right for that role.
Thank you. Helen, do you have anything to add on scenario-based questions from a dyslexic perspective?
No, I pretty much agree with the things that have been said. The only point I would make is if they are there, if they've been given sort of written scenarios, then allow time for them to actually read it through, probably in advance, because the first read through might actually be kind of decoding the words, and then the second read through is actually understanding what's being asked, and then the third one is thinking about how you would respond to it. So it might take them longer to do it, but that doesn't mean it's because they can't think of what to say. It's because they're actually understanding what they're being asked.
Thank you. We've got sorry, one final question now that's just come through, which is quite a sensitive one actually, so I think well worth asking. After an interview or assessment, how do you sensitively communicate to a candidate whose neurodivergence is actually a barrier to them carrying out a role? And is this discrimination? Helen, maybe we can start with you.
I think it depends what the barrier is. And I think that's why it's very important to have a very fine sort of framework on which you're actually kind of able to not judge people, but kind of grade people so that you actually know this is what we need someone to be able to do. And then also that you have considered whether they can do it with reasonable adjustments in place. But it is, you know, it is a difficult one. Particularly, I mean, I guess in a lot of cases, people don't get feedback to that level. They just get, sorry, you've been unsuccessful. But the difficult one, I guess, is when people actually ask for feedback. And there obviously is a very fine line between being seen as discriminating against them, and that may well be how the person feels, however you actually term it. So it's being very, very clear and able to kind of quantify that decision, I think.
Thank you, Helen. Danae, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would hope there's never a scenario in which someone's not giving someone a job because of their condition. Presumably, they're not giving them the job because they've been really clear on the requirements of the post holder to do that job. the post holder hasn't been able to demonstrate that, or the post holder has adjustments that are required that still won't result in them being able to do that job. And I think that's why it's really important to be clear and concise about the specific requirements of the post holder, and be open to exploring where those requirements can't be met without adjustments, and considering whether those adjustments are manageable and reasonable or not. So I think if you've done it properly from the outset, then the feedback shouldn't be difficult to give, because it's not about somebody's condition, it's about their ability to meet the requirements of the role.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Helen and Danae. This has been brilliant. This has been really, really insightful, really, really helpful. I have to say, so as I mentioned, my younger brother's autistic and got a diagnosis in the mid to late 90s. I remember back then, the only people I knew that had heard of autism had seen the film Rain Man, and there's probably 3 or 4 people that I knew were aware of what autism was. When we went out to promote this webinar, so many people were so interested in hearing you both speak. And I think that's a great sign, and hopefully so many people here today will be able to start putting some of these things into what's the word I'm looking for, start using some of the tools that you've suggested. So we'll be giving a donation to both British Dyslexia Association and Ambitious About Autism as a token of our appreciation. Thank you very, very much. We'll also be sharing a recording of today's session and the slides with everyone that registered. We might also put a link onto our previous one, which was with RNIB and RNID in relation to sensory impairment. And we're hoping to continue this series, so we'll keep you all posted on our next event. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of your week and weekend, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.